doing our public history. And as you know, these webinar series is part of the mission of the United States Capitol Historical Society. We are an organization chartered by Congress to tell the story of the Capitol and the people who work in here in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. And part of that is telling the story of the people behind the Capitol itself, the building. And that's what we're talking about today with our esteemed public historian and beloved storyteller, Steve Livengood. So let me set the stage for this. On the northern end of Baltimore in 1843, Irish immigrant Robert Poole, at the ripe old age of 25, opened a modest ironworks facility, hired machinists, molders, boilermakers, and pattern makers. Among the first generation of modern metalworkers, these craftsmen went to work to convert raw iron into gearing and tube turbines and fire engines and coal cars and power generating mechanisms, all destined for the emerging industrialization of America. In the 1850s, Mr. Poole, an engineer and an inventor, came to national attention after his company cast the columns that still encircle the base of the dome of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. By the 1880s, his ironworks employed more than 800 operatives, as hourly and skilled workers were called then, and it had become the leading metal-based manufacturer in Baltimore and Maryland. Today's program is based on the new book, The Metalworkers, Robert Poole, His Ironworks and Technology in 19th Century America by Steven Swett, with illustrations by Stephen Marchesi. This little-known history tells the story of the metalworkers who crafted the drum of the United States Capitol Dome and the Baltimore Company that played a major role in the creation of the cast iron industry in America. People don't realize that the dome is made of cast iron, but we're going to hear more about that story. Now, most of you know Steve Livengood, but we always have to put him also in context. Steve was fascinated by the United States Capitol Historical Building even before he left his native Kansas, where he came from Kansas to volunteer in his congressman's office in 1965. After earning a BA in political science at American University in Washington, D.C., and then serving in the United States Army in Vietnam, Mr. Livengood almost received his doctorate from Emory University. He's did all the work, he just didn't write that final dissertation in U.S. history. So we consider that his life's work is a continuing storytelling conversation. He served as an association executive and public affairs consultant before joining the Capitol Historical Society. In 1998, Mr. Livengood capped 5 years as an active volunteer tour guide in the United States Capitol by becoming the public programs director and senior historical interpreter for the Capitol Historical Society. He now trains congressional staff tour guides, Washington City tour guides, his Capitol Historical Society tour guides, and organizes volunteers for other society programs. And he himself continues to lead specialized VIP tours of the Capitol. And so I'll tell you one story about Steve. 5 years ago, I joined the United States Capitol Historical Society. And, you know, as you do when you're taking over an entity, you get to know the leadership and the senior staff. And I'd heard tales about Steve's tours. And I said, well, Steve, I think I should take one of your tours and so that I can understand. And he looked at me and he said, would you like the 10-hour version or the 1-hour version? That he has 10 hours of material. I did opt for the hour-and-a-half version because I was trying to get my feet underway to understand what's going on. But we really appreciate, Steve, you bringing this story to life and telling us about the metal workers who helped to build the United States Capitol. Take it away.
Thank you, Jane. I want to say that I have spent great many hours lately getting this from the 10-hour version down to the 45 minutes that you have given me today. This Metalworkers presentation is brought to you jointly by the U.S. Capitol Historical Society and the Baltimore Museum of Industry, which is the publisher of the book. It is about Robert Poole, his ironworks, and technology in 19th century America. It's conceived and written by Steven Swett, who is the great-great-grandson of Robert Poole. Stephen Marchesi is the illustrator for most of the drawings that you'll see in this presentation. I am the author of the webinar as well as presenting it today. And this is the book. This illustration is a detail from an 1870 lithograph called The Poole and Hunt Ironworks by A. Hohen and Company of Baltimore. It is an idealized landscape that epitomizes the role of industry and the place of ironworks in American society at the iconic moment in the history of Poole and Hunt and the cast iron industry. This factory was along Jones Falls in Baltimore. You can see the railroad running in front of the factory there. Jones Falls River runs from right to left on the front edge of the picture. It supplied water that made steam that drove machinery in the factory. The creek to the left of the building supplied the water for use in the factory and emptied into Jones Falls. The house on the left margin was the first of several double houses running up a steep hill and built for the factory workers at this plant. Robert Poole's house and estate were built on the other side of Jones Falls River on a hill overlooking the plant. These buildings in the drawing still exist, now turned into upscale condos and a fancy restaurant. The workers' houses still exist on a very steep street, but several of them have been upgraded and all seem to be very well maintained. My connection to this story begins with these columns around the base of the dome of the U.S. Capitol. They are certainly the most famous works Robert Poole ever produced. Most folks who look at the Capitol dome assume the entire structure is marble, like the walls of the main structure. But in fact, the dome itself is entirely iron and only painted white to look like the rest of the building. Poole and Hunt, Robert Poole's company, made not only the iron columns we see around the base of the dome, but also made the structural parts that support the dome not visible from the outside. Poole's accomplishments extend far beyond the columns and the Capitol, but these are his most famous works and permanent artifacts. So we will look at the Capitol project first and then fit it into the larger history as told in the book. The U.S. Capitol was located on a river terrace in what is now Washington, D.C. in 1792. The Senate wing, to the right in this photograph, was built first. The Congress and much of the federal government moved into that wing in 1800. The House wing, to the left in the photograph, was completed by 1805. These two sections were all that had been completed when the British came and burned them in 1814. But despite the fire, the walls were sound and the two buildings were reconstructed by 1819. This photograph of the Capitol is the earliest known. It shows the dome that was completed with the rotunda below it by 1824. The Capitol grounds were completed by 1828, and that is the date we give for completion of the building as originally designed. It took 38 years of planning and construction. The old dome and the smaller domes on each side were wooden covered in copper. That building was planned when we had 15 states and expected to have about 25. Instead, by the time the building was completed, the country was 3 times the size it was when we started. When California became a state far in the west, the building was clearly too small. The members of Congress got no staff and no office. All they got was a desk in the chamber. When California became a state, there was no room for any more desks, and we knew there would be many more states between Missouri and California. The House chamber, which we now know as Statuary Hall, was jammed with 262 desks. The Congress decided to add a new chamber on each end of the building, and construction began in 1850. By 1855, it became clear that the wooden dome had dried out and was a fire trap. The Congress asked the architect of the extensions to rebuild the wooden dome as well. The architect pointed out that a larger building requires a larger dome, and he proposed a dome as shown in the drawing here. But the foundations of the building would not hold the weight of a stone dome or even a wooden one of these proportions. That Capitol architect, Thomas Walter, was already one of the most prominent and well-connected architects in the United States. He was using a wonderful lightweight new material in the Capitol extensions already under construction, cast iron. We think of cast iron as heavy, but in that era, it was by far the lightest construction material available. It is much lighter than stone and stronger than wood in proportion to its weight. Architect Walter proposed that the new dome be made entirely of that cast iron. The magnificent dome we have today weighs little more than the wooden dome that was 1/3 its size, so there was no need to reinforce the Capitol foundation. To understand how the Capitol project proceeded, we need to note the fact that Washington, D.C. had no local elected government. Appointed federal commissioners ran the city, and the Army Corps of Engineers was in charge of infrastructure. In 1853, the Army engineers took on the assignment of providing fresh, clean water for the city of Washington. Like most cities at the time, Washington had no water system and no sewers, and people drank from wells contaminated by the city's own waste. Typhoid was epidemic, and President Lincoln's own son later died of it. Foreign governments classified Washington as a hardship assignment for their diplomats. The man assigned to take on this very visible problem was a brash young engineer, Captain Montgomery C. Meigs, a top graduate in his class at West Point at age 20 and now age 37. Meigs made a plan to draw good water from far up the Potomac River at Great Falls and bring it to a reservoir in Washington, purify it, and pipe it into the city. The 12 miles of aqueduct would end with a fountain at the base of the Capitol on the west side. This plan was accepted, and Meigs was put in charge of construction. The aqueduct Meigs built still brings water to the city of Washington today. As he was preparing this aqueduct project, Meigs found a company nearby that kept an inventory of construction equipment, so he could quickly receive tools and machinery without waiting for them to be manufactured. The company was Poole and Hunt of Baltimore. They responded quickly when Meigs ordered steam engines and other equipment, and he came to rely on them for the aqueduct project. Meanwhile, the new federal administration of President Franklin Pierce and new leadership in Congress was rearranging power in Washington, D.C. The Capitol construction project was moved from the architect appointed in the Whig administration of President Fillmore to the Army Corps of Engineers under the Democratic Party administration of President Franklin Pierce and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Meigs was made supervisor of that project as well, and his relationship with Poole and Hunt was expanded to the Capitol Extension and Dome project as well. On the right of the screen is a sketch that Meigs sent Poole to show what was needed for one block and tackle for the Capitol project. Meigs was ambitious as well as brash. We know so because he kept a daily diary of his activities and accomplishments. Therefore, historians have a rare insight into his reasoning and his motives for the many projects he directed during his career. He became so famous that his diary was translated out of his obscure shorthand language and published for the bicentennial of the Capitol in 2000. Meigs also documented the entire Capitol project, the first time photography was used for that purpose. And he required that every piece of cast iron in the aqueduct and the Capitol have his name on it, and he made the suppliers such as Poole eat the cost of this alteration. Based on his experience with Poole and Hunt for the construction equipment, Meigs encouraged them to bid on casting for the columns and other parts for the Capitol dome. Cast iron was a brand new construction material, and no manufacturer had experience with such processes as making classical columns out of iron and painting them to look like marble. Meigs pointed out to Poole that as the closest supplier to Washington, D.C., Poole's transportation costs would be lower. The bids were made per pound of iron delivered to the site. Poole and Hunt won the bid by 2/10 of a cent out of a bid of 3 4/10 cents per pound. Here on the left is a drawing of a column as it would be installed. The reddish section on the bottom center of the drawing is the existing brick Capitol wall under the old dome, to which the new construction had to be attached and which had to bear the weight of the new dome. While the columns are the most obvious and famous Poole product, Poole also made the brackets to support the columns and the pilasters against the wall of the dome, and at least some of the gutters and downspouts for the drainage system. On the right is the photograph of the columns as they were being installed. The Capitol columns are the first known classical columns ever cast in iron for a public building. Prior to this, cast iron was generally functional and not decorative. Poole did tests that quickly determined the columns could not be cast horizontally, as was the conventional casting method. That's what you see here. They had to be cast vertically, which is Poole's invention. On the left, the workers are shown lowering the mold into the pit that held the mold vertical, dug straight into the factory floor in Baltimore. On the right is a cross-section of the pit showing the mold inside, surrounded by sand and soil backfill. Workers had 45 seconds to fill the mold evenly and completely before the molten iron could harden. In this drawing on the left, the metalworkers lift the mold out of the pit as soon as the iron is solidified enough to do so. Then the shaft cools more in the open air of the factory. On the right, the shaft of the column is being lifted out of the mold once it cooled to external temperature. This drawing is based on a photograph taken at the time showing the way columns were hauled to the Capitol for installation. This drawing is Poole also cast the pilasters, which are semi-columns attached to the wall of the building. The pilasters hid the cast iron pillars that actually support the dome. Inside the rotunda, at the base of the cast iron structure, are these decorative panels that were also cast by Poole's company. They are square with elaborate depictions of leaves framing a plain, slightly darker color square. Below these panels is the stone ledge from the original rotunda, and above them is the frieze of American history with elaborate Brumidi frescoes of events in the history of America. Poole had begun supplying the construction equipment for the Meigs projects in 1853. His relationship with Captain Meigs continued to thrive after that, and these elaborate decorations were all installed between 1855 and 1859. But Poole received no new orders after 1858, and his involvement with the Capitol project ended with the installation in 1859. Poole and Hunt's work is all below the center of the photograph you see here. The reason was that Captain Meigs was transferred out of the project, being sent to lead the completion of the largest U.S. fort then under construction in the dry Tortugas Islands off the south of Key West, Florida. Everyone knew this was a political banishment for Meigs, who had engaged in an escalating feud with the Capitol architect Thomas Walter. The two eventually stopped speaking to each other and communicated only through subordinates. Finally, under the new president, James Buchanan, architect Walter was able to get the War Department to remove Meigs, leaving Walter in full charge of the Capitol project at last. After Meigs left, Poole had no more connection with the Capitol Extension project and got no more contracts. The remainder of the dome, including the 12 pillars at the top constituting the tholos, or lantern, just below the Statue of Freedom, were supplied by Janes Beebe and Company of Brooklyn, New York, the favored contractor of architect Thomas Walter. Today, the Capitol Dome is 171 years old. Poole products were installed early in the construction, making them as much as 177 years old. By the time the Capitol Dome was 100 in the 1960s, it had deteriorated to the point that pieces of the decoration were falling off onto the Capitol roof. Finally, in the 1990s, full restoration of the dome took place, patching cracks in the cast iron plates and recasting decorations that had deteriorated past rehabilitation. The Capitol Dome, including Robert Poole's most famous works, is now in the best shape it has ever been and prepared to enter its third century just a few years from now. Poole's contribution to the Capitol Dome and extensions can best be measured in pounds of iron installed. The chart on the right from the Metalworkers book compiles nearly 3 million pounds of Poole iron in the dome. This constituted about 1/3 of the 9 million pounds of iron in the completed dome. So now we detailed Poole's Capitol Dome project, so let's go back and look at how Robert Poole came to this role. So who was Robert Poole? There are a few photographs of him, and only as an old man. On the right, Poole is pictured with his son and successor, George Poole, and Robert Poole's young grandson, Robert Poole II. These photographs show Poole as an elderly man, which makes it more difficult to imagine him as a young and vigorous entrepreneur doing the work himself, even as he began to hire employees. Therefore, Poole's great-grandson, Steve Swett, commissioned several drawings for this book showing Poole at work as he would probably have appeared. In this drawing, Poole is working for Ross Winans, the famous engineer who designed the first railroad engines. Poole is working under the engine while Winans observes. Here, Poole is speaking with a banker about a loan to start his own factory. Robert Poole was born in 1818 in the tiny village of Gulladuff, Ireland. He was a model success story of an Irish immigrant from a poor background, what they would call a self-made man. His father was a farmer. His mother spun flax at home to make linen. His father died young, so Robert's mother immigrated to the United States, to Baltimore, with her only child, Robert. They went to Baltimore, which at that time was the third largest city in the United States, behind only Philadelphia and New York City. All three cities in most of the United States were booming with the energies associated with the freedom that lured immigrants from around the world. Robert was apprenticed and not educated in schools. He was given 3 successive apprenticeships, first in a blacksmith operation, next in a new textile mill. The third was for the B&O Railroad in its early decades. Poole lived all the rest of his life in Baltimore except for his textile apprenticeship, which was only a few miles outside the city. In 1842, Poole borrowed funds and built an iron foundry on the edge of downtown Baltimore on North Avenue. He had a partner, William Ferguson, and later acquired a financial partner, Thomas Smith, who was also a major customer. The business was set up in the tail end of the Panic of 1837, the worst depression before the Civil War in the United States. His foundry was very successful and quickly doubled in size. By 1846, it had doubled again and employed more than 100 men. In 1851, Poole and Ferguson dissolved their partnership. Poole was age 31, and he set up a new partnership with 22-year-old German Hunt. That partnership lasted 40 years. Thomas Smith continued as financial partner of Poole and Hunt. The company's most successful product was steam engines. One of their engines powered Baltimore's Industrial Exhibition of 1846. Poole and Hunt made cast iron machine tools, one-at-a-time equipment for factories. They also made gears and shafts for other factories. They developed tools for their own use and then sold copies of those tools to other companies. This is a drawing of a lathe such as Poole's Metalworkers would have used in that era. Most famously, they made a 6,000-gallon giant kettle for soap and candle manufacturing. They also made a machine to make seines for fishermen. Riding the boom of the rail industry, Poole and Hunt made railroad cars, particularly hopper cars for coal. This photograph shows some hoppers emerging from the Poole and Hunt factory. They began to make freight cars for the railroad. This drawing shows the first freight cars had only a frame on wheels. They made railroad wheels, one of the first production items fabricated in the Poole and Hunt factory for sale and not made to order. In 1853, just at the peak of Poole and Hunt production, a devastating fire destroyed their factory in downtown Baltimore. Such fires were quite common in that era. The fire led Poole and Hunt to move to a larger site just outside of Baltimore where they could draw water from Jones Falls River to make steam for power. The town of Woodbury was in the countryside up the river from Baltimore. That town is now a neighborhood incorporated into Baltimore. This is the Woodbury neighborhood around the new Poole and Hunt factory. Several other factories had already been developed nearby, particularly cotton mills producing cotton duck cloth for the sails of ships. The red dots on the map show the mills were arranged along the river in order to use the power of the river. Poole and Hunt's factory is at the bottom left of this map, with the other mills across the Jones Falls River. In the 1850s, this 1850s photograph of the factory, the buildings have grown and multiplied with Poole and Hunt, using all of the buildings surrounding those two smokestacks. Several of those buildings and parts of some other buildings still stand today. This is a site map of the Poole and Hunt factory as it developed by 1896. It was not long after moving to the new factory in 1853 that Poole and Hunt bid on casting the columns for the Capitol dome. Poole and Hunt supplied ironwork and machinery for other government projects in this period, including the Patent Office, which is now the National Portrait Gallery in Northwest Washington. The General Post Office, now the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and formerly the Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. The Treasury Department, which is still a monumental building next to the White House. The Treasury was heated by an engine and 3 boilers from Poole and Hunt. At the same time they were part of the Capitol construction, Poole and Hunt were getting into a number of other projects on the vanguard of industrial progress, particularly for city services. They were among the first to manufacture steam fire engines. Poole and Hunt supplied 5 of the 12 steam fire engines that Baltimore purchased between 1858 and 1869. Horse-drawn rail cars for city transportation became suddenly very popular because cities were booming. Poole and Hunt were ready to supply that need based on their experience with freight cars and steam fire engines. Horse car number 1 in Baltimore was a Poole and Hunt product. Horse cars continued to operate in Baltimore into the 1890s, but most cities quickly switched to cable cars. Civil War broke out in 1861. Robert Poole, along with most of the civic leadership in Baltimore, supported the Union cause, for which they were stoned by local residents during the Baltimore riots of April 1861. Poole and Hunt supported the Union and contracted for work with the federal government. They had been paid a total of $68,000 for their 4 years of work on the Capitol building, but by 1864 they were collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, exceeding all their work prior to the war. This was for boilers and steam engines, particularly for the Navy. This image is a painting of the battle for Plymouth, North Carolina, where the USS Shamrock, powered by a Poole and Hunt engine, led the naval force that captured the fort. At the peak of the Civil War, Poole and Hunt began the transformation for a peacetime economy. An Ohio inventor named James Leffel had developed a revolutionary new type of turbine, far more efficient because it could be made of iron rather than wood, and asked Robert Poole to manufacture, sell, and install his product. This changed the focus of the company. Up to this time, Poole and Hunt made and sold their own products and inventions. This would be the first time that Poole agreed to manufacture and promote someone else's invention. In the 1860 census, Poole had identified himself as a machinist. The Leffel turbine transformed Poole's company into a manufacturer, not just a machine shop. Poole and Hunt continued to develop their own products, but by 1870, their stationery featured Leffel turbines rather than their own inventions. On the left is a Leffel turbine, and on the right you can see the turbines are the primary products shown on their stationery from 1870. By the time the Civil War was concluded, Poole and Hunt was a nationally recognized industrial leader, and Robert Poole had hired several layers of management for his company. Most symbolic of Poole's status was the home he built across Jones Falls River, overlooking his industrial properties. 31 rooms on 3 floors. It was named Maple Hill. His workers' houses we saw on the cover of the book faced Poole's house across the valley. Even as he was spending his time on corporate and industrial leadership, Poole kept working as an engineer. The proof is in the dates of his patents. Poole held a total of 11 patents, most of them after the Civil War. Of course, the date of the patent does not tell us when Poole invented these machines, only when he registered his patents. Probably because he left the decorative casting business, the vertical casting process for the Capitol pillars was never patented. The author, Steve Swett, has given an unusual amount of attention to the workers in this industry and at this company, even naming the book The Metalworkers after them. Here's a list of the specialties in the metalworking trades that have been identified from research in the history of Poole and Hunt. This is an indication of the scope of the workforce that Robert Poole employed. The list on the left was compiled from Steven Swett's research. In the drawing, Stephen Marchesi shows Robert Poole working in the smithy, forging iron tools and machinery. Here are Poole and Hunt workers shown shaping and joining the parts of a boiler. The most common specialties among Poole and Hunt workers were the draftsman, pattern makers, and molder. Based on the success of his sales of the Leffel turbine, which was Poole's first product patented by someone else, he licensed and began manufacturing the steam boilers with the safety design developed by the still famous Babcock and Wilcox Company. This drawing of Poole and Hunt's tubular safety boiler. Poole built a special separate building for boilers and continued to sell them until electrical power made them obsolete. Poole had worked primarily with new technology, cast iron and steam power, but he also developed products with one ancient technology, gears. The firm was a leader in the gear-making industry during the closing decades of the 19th century. On the left is the cover of Poole and Hunt's catalog, 13th edition, devoted to the gears, pulleys, etc. Their catalog is preserved in the Smithsonian's collections. On the right is Stephen Marchesi's drawing of Robert Poole and John Walker, who worked with Poole and Poole's company to dominate the gear industry in the United States. The ultimate compliment paid to Poole and Hunt's gears is that John A. Roebling Company used Poole and Hunt gears to make the wire rope that holds up the Brooklyn Bridge. That wire rope is 1.5 inches thick and 30,000 feet long. Another product where Poole and Hunt had a long-term market was the pulleys that were necessary for mechanical power transmission before electricity. These two drawings are from the Metalworkers book, showing examples of shafts, pulleys, and machinery that would have used Poole and Hunt pulleys. The company made pulleys for the entire period of the founding, from the founding in 1843 to Robert Poole's death in 1903. The Centennial Exhibition of 1876 is an iconic moment in the history of American industry and society. It was organized as the centerpiece of the celebration of a century of American independence and was held in Philadelphia, the city of our national birth, in 1776. Never before had so many firms in the rapidly expanding metal industry come together in the same place and display their work. This is an image of the machinery hall at the exhibition, 13 acres under one roof, which included nearly 2,000 exhibitors. Poole and Hunt were not only among the exhibitors, but had 4 different locations showing off 4 different products in which they led the nation and the United States led the world. Robert Poole brought his 22-year-old son George and his son-in-law James Hooper to the fair in Philadelphia, and they traveled by train with some 400 other ironworkers and millworkers from Baltimore. The centerpiece of the Centennial exhibition was, appropriately enough, the world's largest steam engine, which powered virtually all of the machinery and equipment for the entire fair. Known as the Corliss steam engine, this noisy, pulsing monster became the symbol not only of the fair itself, but of the industrial age. As a major national organization, Poole and Hunt began to operate extensively in the wider range of industries that were transforming America in the industrial age that dominated American life. At this point, I'm going to move swiftly and superficially through the Poole Company's accomplishments in a number of iconic industries of the age. Cotton mills spread rapidly through the South as it industrialized after the Civil War. Poole and Hunt's turbines and power equipment supplied many of the new textile mills all over the South. Up north, a major technological revolution in the industrial boom after the Civil War was the manufacture of paper. Industrial power allowed paper to be made of wood pulp instead of cotton rags, and paper could be made in rolls instead of sheets. That paper mill owner had contracted to supply the Baltimore American newspaper, among others, and that connection helped result in a Poole-made turbine driving the machinery in Vermont. That factory became the basis of the International Paper Company, which is today the largest paper-producing company in the world. Another major industry transformation that included Poole and Hunt was the storage and milling of grain. Here you see the power train for a grain mill in Rockford, Alabama, as designed by Poole and Hunt engineers on the left. On the right is the machine to unload grain from the holds of ships, which saved labor costs and time for unloading grain in international commerce. Another industry where Poole and Hunt was able to achieve a major role was cable car systems. First in Chicago for the Chicago City Railway Company between 1881 and 1888, making the gearing, shafting, and wire rope drums. Here on the left of this is the Chicago Railway Company route for which Poole and Hunt provided power transmission equipment. You can see the famous loop of the cable cars at the top of the map. On the right is the list of cities that had Poole and Hunt power systems for their cable car companies. Out of 29 cities that built cable systems, 14, nearly half, were powered by Poole and Hunt systems. These Poole and Hunt systems were installed all the way from Providence, Rhode Island to Los Angeles on the West Coast. Only a few years later, the city of Atlanta built the first electric streetcar system, and suddenly the cable car industry was dead. Poole and Hunt's cable car business collapsed. This is a current map of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Reagan National Airport is at the bottom left and the National Mall at the top. At the center, all of the green area forming a long, narrow island in the middle and enclosing the tidal basin at the top is created land dredged from the river. Poole and Hunt built the centrifugal pump linked to a Poole and Hunt impeller, which sucked up silt from the riverbed and pushed it through a pipe and discharged it thousands of feet away to create that parkland. Jefferson Memorial sits on land created with Poole and Hunt equipment. This employment chart shows the peak years of Robert Poole's company. The markets we have been discussing made the company larger and larger into the 1890s. The book is entitled The Metalworkers to give due credit to the workers who actually performed the labor from which Robert Poole and his partners prospered. The quality of Robert Poole's leadership is demonstrated by the fact that this organization included many long-term and loyal employees who could easily have left for better jobs elsewhere. But they remained loyal to Poole and Hunt and to Robert Poole himself. One of Poole's longtime employees, the son of a man who had worked there for 53 years, described the situation this way, quote, "Mr. Poole was a great believer in the apprentice system. A part of his success was due to the fact that he educated his own mechanics to do their work in the proper manner," end quote. Another measure of Robert Poole's leadership is that after a single work stoppage at the beginning of the organized labor movement, Poole and Hunt experienced no major labor disruption for the following 30 years of Poole's leadership. Much of American industry was a battleground between labor and the capitalists who owned the factories and organized industries, but Robert Poole seems to have retained the respect and support of the workers in his company. Study of employee tenure at Poole and Hunt shows long tenures and entire working lives crossing generations at Poole's company. The next year, 1889, German Hunt retired from the partnership and a new company was formed, Robert Poole and Son, with George Poole, Robert Poole's eldest son. George had worked his way up in the company from apprentice to journeyman to manager. In 1888, George was 35 and Robert Poole was 70, so it was time for George to take over leadership of the company. Under George Poole's leadership, a prominent product of the Poole and Son Company was mortar carriages for coastal defenses. The guns in this photo were part of a naval defense buildup as the United States became a world power after the Spanish-American War. Many of the iron carriages that held the guns were produced by Poole and Son. The Poole Company never did make the transition to steel. They stayed in the business of making iron machinery and installing steel equipment made by other companies. We saw how the columns of the Capitol Dome have stayed in place over nearly 170 years. Turbines made by the Poole Company under George Poole's leadership can claim a longevity record too. Around 1900, the company had made and installed 40 turbines at an early hydroelectric station at York Haven, Pennsylvania, beside the Susquehanna River. It was the company's largest such installation. Remarkably, more than half of those turbines continue to drive electricity-producing generators at that station after nearly 125 years of continuous operation. Robert Poole is not well known for his philanthropy, but in fact was a major donor of many institutions near his home in Woodbury. From the Methodist Church and the Catholic Cemetery to Goucher College and Morgan State University, he was significant in their founding. The most important building donated by Robert Poole is the local branch of the famous Enoch Pratt Free Library. Poole paid for the grand brick building near his plant, but made it the 7th branch of Enoch Pratt's library. This was the first branch not built with Enoch Pratt's money. In 1903, Robert Poole died, age 85, and was buried in a plot that he had purchased in Greenmount Cemetery next to his wife. Upon his father's death, George incorporated the business as Poole Engineering and Machine Company, but George Poole himself died suddenly only 7 years later in 1910. After that, institutional investors exploited what had been a family business and in 1932 drove the enterprise into bankruptcy, 90 years after its founding. The book presents a series of drawings of Poole and Hunt's factory at 10-year intervals, showing how it grew and how it looked to the artists who depicted it for company publicity purposes. The author of the book has carefully reproduced and juxtaposed these drawings for a perspective on the history of Poole and Hunt. Because these drawings were created for company publicity, they reflect Poole and Hunt's view of itself and the state of industrial development in the second half of the 19th century. It's an interesting perspective as we look back on that era. This early scene of the Poole factory from around 1858, when the Capitol columns were made, shows it as part of a welcoming landscape. The developer has preserved parts of the Poole and Hunt buildings and added new sections. Sorry, I got my pages out of order. Anyway, this is the drawing which is used on the cover of the book, and you can see it's the left side here. But this is what it looked like, a very idealized kind of landscape. Then this one is 10 years later, and we see lots of smoke, but the company was obviously proud of the smoke. They put it in their own publicity to show that they were working hard and carrying out the functions. And then this is the 1898 landscape. Then in 1993, there was a fire again, and this is what's left of that of this section on the left there, their original building, and it was left looking like this. But today it looks like this. The developer has preserved parts of the Poole and Hunt buildings. You can see that's a sculpture, and it seems to be hanging from a pulley that probably was taken from the Poole and Hunt factory. And then this is what's next door on a warm day when I walk by. So that's part of the Poole factory wall in the background there. This is the Poole and Hunt office building across the street from the swimming pool. The older looking section to the right is the old Poole and Hunt office building. To the left is a new section where the blacksmith shop used to be. This is the upscale restaurant, the Woodbury Kitchen, which now occupies the area where the Poole Foundry used to be. So this is where the pits were dug to cast the Capitol columns. I took these photographs in 2023. These houses from the cover of the book still exist, but are differentiated in decoration, so it's obvious they are owned separately. Still standing today across the Baltimore transit tracks from Poole and Hunt site is Meadow Mill, one of the largest cotton duck factories from that era. It had space for 600 employees and was run by a 600 horsepower steam engine that had a 43,000-pound driving wheel cast by Poole and Hunt just across the street. So I think that's enough for you to think about. What questions do we have, Jane?
Well, my goodness, what a story. Thank you so much for sharing that, Steve. So you can stop sharing your screen and then we can see you for the conversation.
Okay.
We already have a question from one of our listeners who wants to know, does the book talk at all about a guild of metal workers? Was there some sort of contract grievance? Were there any work stoppages or any of those kind of activities?
Yes, no work stoppages that are recorded. Part of the book I didn't even get into. The author talks carefully about the accidents that got into the newspaper. There are very few records of the company itself. We do know that some of them were involved in the American Society of Civil Engineers and Mechanical Engineers. And so it would be that kind of an organization. And there does not seem to have been a union or guild operation connected here. It's not recorded historically anyway.
And was there anything about, I understand there was a brass shop somewhere on the Capitol grounds. Was that at all addressed in this book, or do you have information about that?
To my knowledge, Poole and Hunt did not do anything in brass, and the things that I know that are Poole and Hunt's, it's all cast iron.
Got it.
There would have been a brass shop, but it wouldn't have been Poole and Hunt's.
And so someone carefully went on Amazon trying to find the book. It's not available on Amazon, but I want to assure everybody that we will give you information in the follow-up email with the access to the video about how to get the book. So not to fret, the opportunity.
Yeah, the book is on our website.
It is on our website. You can purchase it from the United States Capitol Historical Society. So in the beginning, where did Poole get his original pig iron?
It would have been local to Baltimore. There were iron development all over Pennsylvania, Maryland, particularly in the mountains. Just north of there are the famous ironworks that Thaddeus Stevens had in Pennsylvania. That was a big industry, and that's one of the reasons why Baltimore became important in that industry. Is that you had both the coal and the iron that could be made locally.
Got it. And did Poole and Meigs have a personal relationship? I mean, you talked about the requirements that Mr. Meigs put in, but did the two of them collaborate?
Probably not with much more than that. Meigs made that requirement on all of his contractors, so it wasn't specific to Poole and Hunt. But he obviously liked Poole and Hunt because they were ready to do anything he wanted. and they were nearby. The other contractors were in New York and places like that. So Poole, the bids were always delivered, and so the delivery cost was on the contractor, and so it was to Poole's advantage that he was in Baltimore and all the others were further away.
And you talked about Poole casting the bottom section of the dome. Was there a
Yes.
different company that cast the upper portion of the dome?
Yes, that's the James Beebe company that was favored by Thomas Walter.
Okay.
So everything sort of above that middle line, the top of the columns there was as far as Poole and Hunt got. And you can see that's about a third of the structure. And so I'm not sure how much James Beebe company did before Meigs left, but they did almost everything afterwards.
Got it. And then somebody else asked about, did the book talk about any of the competitors? There was apparently a competitor, Creswell in Philadelphia, that made the iron for the Michigan State Capitol Dome.
Well, this was all sole source contracting. There were competitors, but nobody knew what they were doing anyway. So there wasn't a developed market, and Poole did not stay in that market. The Capitol Dome are the only things that he did, as far as we know, in construction materials.
Got it. Now, someone's like looking at our logo and trying to figure out the dome component. Is the dome component that Freedom stands on? Are those columns Poole columns, or just
No, those are the ones that were done by James Beebe. If you look at the bottom section that's covered with the red and white stripe, it's that section down below, those lowest windows are where are all the Poole and Hunt. They didn't do anything above that bottom section there.
Got it. And did the Poole Company do Army business during the Civil War? You mentioned that they were Union supporters.
They did some Army business, but their primary business was the steam engines for ships.
Got it. And was Poole at all involved in the Statue of Freedom, or was that a completely separate?
No, that's completely separate. Yeah.
Got it. Got it.
And Meigs was long gone by that point. So.
And one of the things that seemed, this is going to be our last question because we're up against our time, and we know that our folks are pretty dedicated about that. And so let's kind of put these two things together. What did you learn about what kind of maintenance those columns need to have in order to continue? It's been quite a long time since those columns were made. So what's necessary to maintain them so that they'll be there for generations to come?
Well, the maintenance was perfunctory or certainly not effective until the 1990s, and that's when they decided to just cover the whole thing in scaffolding. If you remember, it was a couple of years that it was covered, and they found a company that repaired steam engines for ships. And they were able to make patches in cast iron. You can't weld cast iron. And so they had to come up with a way of patching. You cut into the iron itself, and they made a little key thing that that stuck out on both sides and held the two cracked pieces together, held the two sides of a crack together. And then they polish it so that there's no way that the water can get in between the patch there. It was a very elaborate process, and they had demonstrations, a whole display about it in the Capitol Rotunda during that period. I don't know if any of that is still online, but it was an amazing process. So they did not do much until the 1990s, and then there were pieces falling off the whole thing, 40 and 50 pound pieces of iron falling onto the roof. And so they finally decided they had to do something about it. And that is when they repaired the whole thing. So it is actually in much better shape than it was when it was originally constructed. So I have a lot of faith in our ability to at least keep that dome for several generations to come.
Well, thank you, Steve, for telling us about the people who worked on it, and the people who made that happen.
Let me say one more thing, Jane.
Of
I should
course.
explain why I'm dressed the way I am. I thought it was inappropriate for me to wear a coat and tie and white shirt to talk about these men who got dirty as they worked. And so I'm wearing my U.S. Capitol Historical Society shirt in honor of the metalworkers.
All right. Go, Steve. And speaking of in honor of the workers at the Capitol, we do want to say that it is coming into the holiday season where we take a break from the webinars as people are involved with many of their busy activities. But I do want to remind you that one way that you can continue to support the Capitol Historical Society is to shop online at our store. We have fabulous ornaments. We talked about when the Capitol was restored, when the Capitol steps were restored. Capitol gave us some of that marble, and that is now available in Christmas ornaments, cookie jars, bookends, and then we have fun socks that have the Capitol. You can get socks that are Democrat or Republican if you want to be on one team or the other. But that is an opportunity for all of you. So we would encourage you to take a look at the ornaments, at the special activities that we have. We've got good bundles of ornaments. And so before you go out and, go to, your everyday store, come look at ours and see if there's something unique that allows you to support Capitol history and also provide very unique gifts. Thank you all for your help, for your support. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. Have a healthy, happy new year, and we'll see you in January. Be well. Goodbye.